At the beginning of the book of Daniel, we are transported to a tumultuous period in Israel's history. The setting takes place at the end of the 7th century BCE, during the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. This was a time of spiritual and political decline for the kingdom, marked by disobedience to God and a departure from his laws. Due to this unfaithfulness, the Lord allowed the nation to fall into the hands of a powerful conqueror, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. As described in Daniel 1:1-2, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the house of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. This event marked the beginning of the Babylonian exile, one of the most traumatic experiences for the people of Israel. Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem was not merely a military act. For the Jews, it was the fulfillment of warnings given by prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah, who had foretold God's judgment if the people did not repent. The fall of Jerusalem served as a painful lesson about the consequences of disobedience. After the conquest, Nebuchadnezzar ordered a select group of young nobles and members of the royal family of Judah to be brought to Babylon. The purpose was to incorporate them into the administrative elite of his vast empire. Among these young men was Daniel, a youth distinguished for his wisdom, ability to learn, and unwavering faith. He, along with his companions Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, would become central figures in a story of faithfulness and courage that resonated across centuries. Daniel 1:3 recounts, "Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. This education was not merely academic, but also cultural and spiritual. Nebuchadnezzar aimed to transform these Jewish youths into loyal servants, stripping them of their identity and faith to assimilate them into Babylonian customs and practices. They were to learn the language, literature, and religion of the Chaldeans, becoming fully immersed in a new culture. Additionally, Daniel and his friends had their names changed as part of this assimilation process. According to Daniel 1:7, the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. These new names were linked to Babylonian deities, reinforcing Nebuchadnezzar's attempt to sever their connection to their Jewish heritage. However, even amid this forced re-education, Daniel and his friends remained steadfast in their faith. They did not forget who they were or the God they served. This initial resistance is a hallmark of the narrative, demonstrating that, though captives in a foreign land, they remained free in their commitment to the Lord. Daniel 1:8 highlights this faithfulness. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. This seemingly simple act was, in fact, a profound demonstration of courage and loyalty. Refusing the king's food could be interpreted as disrespect or rebellion, which might easily result in death. Yet Daniel trusted in God and was determined to honor him above all. Daniel's faithfulness did not go unnoticed. In verse 9 we read, "Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. The Lord blessed Daniel's determination and opened doors for him to adhere to his convictions." Daniel proposed a test to the chief official. He and his friends would eat only vegetables and drink water for 10 days, while the other youths continued consuming the king's provisions. At the end of the period, their physical conditions would be compared. Daniel 1:15-16 describes the outcome. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead. This episode not only demonstrated God's faithfulness in honoring those who obey him, but also established respect for Daniel and his friends in the Babylonian court. This initial period in Babylon was not merely a test for Daniel and his friends, but also a preparation for the greater challenges they would face. God was shaping them to be lights in the darkness, instruments of his revelation in a foreign land. As noted in Daniel 1:17, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. Thus, Daniel's story begins as an account of faithfulness in adversity. Despite circumstances that could have crushed their identity and faith, Daniel and his companions remained steadfast, trusting God to guide them. This beginning sets the stage for the extraordinary experiences and visions Daniel would later have, revealing not only his devotion, but also God's sovereign plan for the future. The story of Daniel and his friends in Babylon gains depth as they face their first major tests of faith. As captives chosen to serve in King Nebuchadnezzar's court, they were placed in positions of privilege and responsibility. However, with this privilege came the expectation that they would fully assimilate into Babylonian culture, abandoning the traditions and laws that had guided their lives as faithful Jews. In the first chapter of the book of Daniel, verse 5 states, "The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal delicacies and the wine he drank, and they were to be trained for 3 years, so that at the end of that time they might stand before the king." These provisions, sourced from the royal table, were considered the luxuries of the Babylonian court. But for Daniel and his friends, they posed a significant dilemma. The food and wine from the king's table often did not align with the dietary laws established by God for the people of Israel in the Torah. Moreover, many of these items were offered to pagan gods before being served, making their consumption even more problematic for those determined to remain faithful to the Lord. Eating or drinking from these royal provisions would, for Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, amount to spiritual defilement. In verse 8, we read about Daniel's resolve. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. This was a bold and faith-filled decision. Refusing the king's orders could easily be seen as an act of disobedience, potentially resulting in severe punishment or even death. Nevertheless, Daniel trusted in the Lord and was determined to remain faithful, even in a foreign land. This act of faithfulness did not go unnoticed. In verse 9, the Bible says, "Now God had brought Daniel into favor and goodwill with the chief of the eunuchs." This divine favor allowed Daniel to present a proposal to Ashpenaz, the chief of the eunuchs. Daniel requested that he and his 3 friends be permitted to consume only vegetables and water, thereby avoiding the king's delicacies and wine. In verse 12, Daniel proposes, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink." This proposal was both a test of Daniel's faith and a demonstration of God's power. At the end of the 10 days, their appearance would be compared to that of the other young men who consumed the royal food. Ashpenaz's agreement to this request was not merely the result of Daniel's persuasion, but a testament to divine providence. In verse 14 we read, "So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. This trial period provided an opportunity to show that obedience to God yields results far surpassing human standards. When the 10 days concluded, the results were astonishing and undeniable. Verse 15 reports, "At the end of 10 days, they appeared healthier and better nourished than all the young men who ate the king's food." Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were visibly healthier than their peers, proving that God's sustenance surpasses any earthly provision. This initial triumph was not just physical, but also spiritual and moral. God honored the faith and fidelity of Daniel and his friends, showing that even in a foreign land, he was in control and caring for his servants. This episode reinforces one of the central themes of the book of Daniel. Faithfulness to God in the face of cultural pressure is always rewarded. Beyond physical benefits, God also blessed Daniel and his friends with exceptional wisdom and understanding. Verse 17 states, "To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds." This divine wisdom enabled them to stand out in the Babylonian court, proving that their faithfulness served as a powerful testimony to who God is. At the end of their preparation, the young men were presented to King Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 19 reveals, "The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service." They became trusted advisors in the king's court, holding positions of prominence and influence while remaining steadfast in their faith. This initial event in the book of Daniel is a profound testament that it is possible to remain faithful to God even in a hostile environment. Daniel and his friends were surrounded by a culture that continually pressured them to abandon their convictions. But with courage and trust in the Lord, they chose to obey his laws. However, the story doesn't end here. The episode of their diet was only the beginning of the trials they would face. God had prepared them for greater challenges, ones that would not only test their faith, but also reveal his sovereignty amidst the greatest empire of that time. Daniel was about to experience visions and events that would forever change his life and the history of God's people. The narrative continues with one of the most striking events in Daniel's life, the interpretation of a mysterious dream that deeply troubled Nebuchadnezzar. This episode showcases not only Daniel's wisdom and faithfulness, but also God's power and sovereign control over human kingdoms and history. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 1, we read, "In the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. The king of Babylon was so disturbed by a dream that he could find no rest. He recognized that the dream carried profound significance, something far beyond an ordinary reverie. Desperate to understand its meaning, Nebuchadnezzar summoned the wise men of Babylon, including magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and Chaldeans, demanding that they reveal both the content and the interpretation of the dream. In verse 5, the king declares, "The dream is gone from me. If you do not tell me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses turned into rubble." This extreme demand demonstrated the seriousness with which Nebuchadnezzar regarded the dream. He sought absolute certainty that the interpretation was genuine and therefore asked for the impossible, that the wise men tell him what he had dreamed without any prior disclosure. The Chaldeans, perplexed, replied in verse 10, "There is no one on earth who can declare the king's matter, for no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such a thing of any magician, enchanter, or Chaldean." This response angered Nebuchadnezzar, and in verse 12 we read that he commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be killed. This decree included Daniel and his friends, who were part of the group of advisors. Upon hearing the sentence, Daniel acted with wisdom and discretion. He approached Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, and requested time to seek the revelation of the dream. In verse 17, we read that Daniel went home and informed Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, so that they might seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery. Daniel and his friends immediately turned to prayer, trusting that the God they served had the power to reveal the deepest secrets. God answered Daniel's prayer, revealing the dream and its interpretation during the night. In verse 20, Daniel praised the Lord, saying, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and power are his. He changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding." This prayer not only expressed gratitude, but also reflected the central theme of the dream, God's sovereign control over the kingdoms of the earth. The next day, Daniel was brought before Nebuchadnezzar, and with humility he declared that the interpretation was not due to his own wisdom, but came from God. In verse 28 he said, "But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the latter days." Daniel then began to describe the king's dream in precise detail. In verse 31, Daniel explained, "You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome." He described the statue made of different materials, the head of pure gold, the chest and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of bronze, the legs of iron, and the feet, a mixture of iron and clay. Daniel then narrated what happened in the vision. In verse 34 he said, "You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. The stone destroyed the entire statue and became a great mountain that filled the whole earth." This powerful image intrigued Nebuchadnezzar even more, but Daniel, with wisdom given by God, offered the interpretation. In verse 38, Daniel explained that the head of gold represented Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire, a mighty kingdom established by God. However, he continued in verse 39, "After you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth." These successor kingdoms were the Medo-Persian and Greek empires, respectively. In verse 40, Daniel described the fourth kingdom, symbolized by iron. "And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others." This kingdom is widely interpreted as the Roman Empire, known for its military strength and overwhelming dominance. Finally, Daniel explained the meaning of the feet mixed with iron and clay. In verse 41, he said, "Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay." This mixture represents the fragility of human alliances in the final days of earthly kingdoms. The climax of the interpretation came with the description of the stone cut without hands. In verse 44, Daniel declared, "And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever." This stone represents God's eternal kingdom, to be established by the Messiah, which will reign forever. At the conclusion, Daniel emphasized that the dream was true and the interpretation faithful. Nebuchadnezzar, amazed and impressed, fell on his face and worshipped Daniel, acknowledging the greatness of the God he served. In verse 47, the king said, "Truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret." As a result, Nebuchadnezzar elevated Daniel to a position of great honor in Babylon, appointing him ruler over the entire province and chief of the wise men. Daniel also interceded for his friends, who were placed in positions of authority. Through this event, God not only revealed his power and wisdom, but also began to demonstrate the fulfillment of his eternal plans in human history. However, the faithfulness of Daniel and his friends would once again be tested under even more dramatic and dangerous circumstances. Following Nebuchadnezzar's dream and its interpretation by Daniel, a new challenge of faith arose for Daniel's friends. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, known by their Babylonian names as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This story, narrated in chapter 3 of the book of Daniel, is one of the most powerful accounts of courage and faithfulness to God in the face of persecution. At the beginning of the chapter, Nebuchadnezzar decided to construct a massive golden statue, measuring 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, which he ordered to be erected on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. In verse 2 we read, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up." The king's objective was clear: to unite his vast empire around a public demonstration of loyalty and devotion to his authority, symbolized by the image. In verse 4, the king's herald proclaimed, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, psaltery, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you must fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." There was also a severe punishment for disobedience. In verse 6 it was decreed, "Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace." This terrifying threat was the ultimate test of loyalty for the peoples under Babylonian rule. However, for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, there was a higher allegiance to God. They knew that worshipping the image would violate the first and second commandments of God's law, which prohibit idolatry. When the music played and the crowds knelt to worship the statue, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood firm. This refusal caught the attention of the Chaldeans, who promptly informed the king. In verse 12 they said, "There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Furious, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the 3 young men to be brought before him. He gave them one last chance to bow before the statue. In verse 15, the king threatened, "And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" This question was both a challenge to their faith and an assertion of his own authority. The young men's response is one of the greatest testimonies of faith and courage recorded in the Bible. In verse 17 they said, "If the God we serve exists, he can rescue us from the blazing furnace and from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up." They did not know whether God would deliver them, but they were willing to die rather than compromise their loyalty. Nebuchadnezzar, consumed with rage, ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. In verse 22, the fire was so intense that the men who carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were killed by the flames. Yet the 3 young men were thrown into the furnace, bound and unresisting. What happened next is one of the Bible's most extraordinary miracles. In verse 24, Nebuchadnezzar, astonished, stood up and asked his advisors, "Did we not throw 3 men bound into the fire?" They replied, "Yes, O king." Then in verse 25, the king exclaimed, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the fire unharmed, and the 4th has the appearance of a son of the gods." The presence of this 4th man in the furnace is widely interpreted as a divine manifestation. Some believe it was the Son of God himself, while others see it as an angel sent to protect them. Either way, it is a clear demonstration of God's care and power to save. Nebuchadnezzar, amazed and shaken, approached the furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Verse 26. When the young men emerged, everyone present saw that the fire had no effect on their bodies, not even their clothes were singed. In verse 27, it is noted, "Not even the smell of fire had clung to them." This display of God's power completely changed Nebuchadnezzar's attitude. In verse 28, he declared, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and risked their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." As a result, the king issued a decree in verse 29. "Therefore I decree that any people, nation or language that speaks against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut into pieces, and their houses turned into rubble. For there is no other God who can save in this way." Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not only saved, but also honored. In verse 30, it is recorded, "Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon." Thus, God rewarded their extraordinary faithfulness, using this event to showcase his sovereignty throughout Babylon. However, while Nebuchadnezzar seemed to acknowledge God's greatness in this moment, his spiritual journey was far from over. Still filled with pride, the king would face another direct encounter with divine power, this time in his own life. In Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar himself narrates the events, beginning with a public proclamation of what God had done in his life. In verse 1, he states, "King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you." This introduction already reveals that something transformative had occurred, and he sought to share what he had learned. The dream is described starting in verse 4. "I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace." He was enjoying a time of great prosperity and stability, satisfied with his power and accomplishments. Yet in verse 5 he admits, "I saw a dream that frightened me, and the thoughts on my bed and the visions of my head alarmed me." As with his earlier dream, Nebuchadnezzar was deeply disturbed, sensing an important meaning behind the vision. In verse 6, the king summoned Babylon's wise men to interpret the dream, but once again they were unable to provide an explanation. It was then that Daniel, known in the court as Belteshazzar, was called. Nebuchadnezzar expressed confidence in Daniel's ability, stating in verse 9, "I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you." In verse 10, the king began recounting his dream. "These were the visions of my head while on my bed. I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great." He described the tree as majestic, its top reaching the heavens and visible to the ends of the earth. Its fruit was abundant, providing sustenance for all living beings. It was an image of grandeur and provision. However, the tone of the dream shifted drastically in verse 13, when the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. This celestial messenger delivered a startling command in verse 14, "Chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get out from under it, and the birds from its branches." Though the tree was to be felled, its stump and roots were to remain in the ground, bound with iron and bronze amidst the grass. The dream continued with a transition linking the tree to King Nebuchadnezzar himself. In verse 16, the watcher declared, "Let his heart be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him." The vision concluded with a decree from the Most High, emphasizing that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will. Verse 17. Troubled, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Daniel to interpret the dream. Upon hearing it, Daniel was stunned and distressed, as described in verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for a time, and his thoughts troubled him. The king urged him to speak, and Daniel eventually revealed the interpretation. In verse 20, Daniel explained that the tree symbolized Nebuchadnezzar and his greatness. He said, "You, O king, have grown and become strong, for your greatness has grown and reaches to the heavens, and your dominion to the end of the earth. However, The decree to chop down the tree was a warning that the king would lose his kingdom temporarily and be reduced to a beast-like state. In verse 25, Daniel elaborated, "They shall drive you from men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses." Yet there was hope. The preservation of the stump and roots signified that the kingdom would be restored once Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged God's sovereignty. In an act of boldness and compassion, Daniel urged the king in verse 27, "Therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity." Despite the warning, Nebuchadnezzar did not change his ways. A year later, as recorded in verse 29, the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, marveling at his accomplishments. In verse 30 he declared, "Is not this great Babylon, that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty?" His arrogance was immediately confronted. In verse 31, while the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven, "King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you." The prophecy was fulfilled. Nebuchadnezzar was driven away from humanity and lived like an animal, eating grass like oxen and being drenched with the dew of heaven. Verse 33 states, "That very hour the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men and ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws." After 7 periods of time, Nebuchadnezzar finally lifted his eyes to heaven and acknowledged God's sovereignty. In verse 34, he declared, "At the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me. And I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever." His humility led to restoration, and he recognized that all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand. Verse 35. In verse 37, Nebuchadnezzar concluded with a personal testimony. "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth, and his ways justice. And those who walk in pride he is able to abase." This transformative experience marked Nebuchadnezzar's life, teaching him that ultimate power belongs to God. However, Babylon's history did not end with his story, as another significant event would soon highlight God's sovereignty even more dramatically. Following the events of Nebuchadnezzar's reign and his recognition of God's sovereignty, the narrative shifts to the reign of Belshazzar, one of Babylon's last rulers. Unlike Nebuchadnezzar, who learned from his experiences and acknowledged the Most High's authority, Belshazzar displayed arrogance and irreverence. This attitude culminated in the infamous writing on the wall episode, recounted in Daniel chapter 5. The chapter begins with Belshazzar hosting a lavish feast. Verse 1 states, "Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. During the celebration, emboldened by wine and hubris, the king committed a grave act of sacrilege. Verse 2 records, "While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. The utensils, which had been taken from the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem during the Babylonian conquest, were sacred and dedicated to God's service. Using these objects at a pagan feast was not only a show of disrespect, but also a direct affront to the God of Israel." Verse 4 recounts, They drank wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. This act demonstrated Belshazzar's complete lack of reverence and his misguided confidence in material gods. At the height of the celebration, something extraordinary occurred. In verse 5 we read, "Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote." This supernatural appearance interrupted the feast and filled the king with terror. Verse 6 describes his reaction. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. Unable to understand the writing's meaning, Belshazzar summoned all the wise men, enchanters, and astrologers in his kingdom to interpret the mysterious words. In verse 7, he promised, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain placed around his neck, and will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." However, none of the wise men could decipher the message, further heightening the king's and his guests' panic. It was then that the queen, likely Belshazzar's mother or grandmother, entered the hall and suggested that Daniel be called. In verse 11 she said, "There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods." Though Daniel was now elderly and seemingly retired from active service at court, he was summoned urgently to interpret the writing. When Daniel arrived, Belshazzar repeated his offer of rewards, but the prophet declined. In verse 17, Daniel replied, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means." Before interpreting the message, Daniel reminded Belshazzar of Nebuchadnezzar's experiences, emphasizing how he had come to acknowledge God's power after being humbled. In verse 22, Daniel confronted the king. "But you, Belshazzar his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this." Daniel then revealed the message written on the wall. In verse 25 he said, "This is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin." He explained the meaning of these words in verse 26. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The message was clear and final. God had judged Belshazzar and his kingdom, and the verdict was condemnation. Pride, irreverence, and disrespect for the Lord had brought about the end of the Babylonian Empire. Despite the gravity of the interpretation, Belshazzar kept his promise, and verse 29 states, "Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom." However, God's judgment was swiftly executed. That same night, as reported in verse 30, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. The armies of the Medes and Persians, led by Cyrus and his general Darius, unexpectedly invaded Babylon, fulfilling the prophecy. In verse 31 we read, "And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. The writing on the wall was not just a milestone in the fall of a great empire, but also a clear demonstration of God's sovereignty over the kingdoms of the earth. He raises and deposes rulers according to his will, and no one is beyond his judgment. For Daniel, who remained faithful throughout the Babylonian era, a new chapter began under the Medo-Persian rule, where he continued to bear witness to God's power and faithfulness. After Babylon's fall and the establishment of the Medo-Persian Empire, Daniel remained an exemplar of faithfulness and devotion to God. Under Darius the Mede, Daniel attained a prominent position in the new government. Chapter 6 of the book of Daniel recounts this period and the conspiracy that led to one of the Bible's most famous miracles, Daniel's deliverance from the lion's den. Verse 1 describes how Darius reorganized his kingdom, appointing 120 satraps to govern the provinces and placing 3 administrators over them. Daniel was one of the administrators and quickly distinguished himself with his wisdom, integrity, and competence. In verse 3 it says, "Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." This decision stirred envy and resentment among the other leaders, who began scheming to bring him down. The conspirators, knowing Daniel's impeccable conduct in his administrative duties, decided to target his faith. In verse 5 they said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." They were aware of Daniel's unwavering commitment to prayer and worship and used this as the basis for a trap. In verse 7, the satraps and administrators approached King Darius with a deceptive proposal. They suggested enacting a law prohibiting anyone from praying to any god or human except the king for 30 days. The punishment for violating this law would be being thrown into the lion's den. Verse 9 records, "So King Darius put the decree in writing." Unaware of the conspirators' true intentions, Darius agreed, likely seeing the decree as an opportunity to consolidate his authority. When Daniel learned that the decree had been signed, he did not change his behavior. In verse 10 we read, "Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, and he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime." Daniel neither hid nor compromised his faith. He continued his practice of prayer with the same consistency and courage as before. The conspirators were waiting for this. In verse 11, they caught Daniel praying and immediately brought the matter to the king. They reminded Darius of the decree and emphasized that Daniel had disobeyed the order. In verse 13, they said, "Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, nor to the decree you have signed, but he prays 3 times a day." Darius, upon hearing this, was deeply distressed. He recognized Daniel's loyalty and realized he had been manipulated. Verse 14 states, "Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to rescue him." However, the laws of the Medes and Persians were immutable, and Darius could not revoke the decree. With a heavy heart, Darius ordered Daniel to be thrown into the lion's den. In verse 16, the king said to Daniel, "Your God, whom you continually serve, he will deliver you." This statement, coming from a pagan king, demonstrates the profound impact Daniel's faith and character had on those around him. The den was sealed with a stone, and the king's seal was placed upon it to ensure no one interfered. Darius spent the night fasting, without entertainment, and unable to sleep, reflecting his deep concern for Daniel. In verse 19 we read that, "At the break of day the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions." Upon reaching the den, Darius called out to Daniel in an anguished voice, asking, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Verse 20. Daniel's response, filled with faith and calmness, was, "O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel and has shut the lions' mouths, so that they have not hurt me, for I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have committed no offense against you." Verses 21 to 22. The miracle was undeniable. Daniel was lifted out of the den, and no injury was found on him, as described in verse 23. Then was Daniel taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. Darius then commanded that the men who had accused Daniel be thrown into the lion's den, along with their families. Verse 24 records, The lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they reached the bottom of the den. Afterward, Darius issued a decree exalting Daniel's God. In verse 26, he declared, "I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and steadfast forever, and his kingdom is one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end." The story of Daniel in the lion's den is a powerful example of perseverance in the face of persecution, and how God protects those who are faithful to him. Even when confronted with an apparently impossible situation, Daniel trusted God without hesitation. His unwavering faith resulted not only in his deliverance, but also in a testimony that reached the entire Medo-Persian Empire. This event marked another moment when God's sovereignty was revealed, setting the stage for the prophetic visions and revelations Daniel would receive later in his life. These visions would bring messages about future kingdoms and God's eternal plan for humanity. Following the miracles and events that shaped Daniel's life under the Babylonian and Medo-Persian empires, the narrative transitions to the prophetic revelations he received. These visions, recorded in chapters 7 to 9 of the book of Daniel, are filled with symbolism and profound messages pointing to God's sovereign plan in human history. While many of these visions deal with future times, they also carry a message of hope about God's eternal kingdom, promising the ultimate triumph of divine justice. In chapter 7, Daniel has a vision that occurs in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, verse 1. He describes a dream in which he saw 4 great beasts coming out of the sea, each different from the other. Verse 3 states, 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. The first resembled a lion with eagle's wings. The second was like a bear. The third appeared as a leopard with 4 bird-like wings. And the fourth beast was dreadful, strong, and exceedingly powerful, with iron teeth and 10 horns. These beasts represented 4 kingdoms that would rise in succession. The lion with eagle's wings is widely interpreted as Babylon, reflecting the grandeur and strength of Nebuchadnezzar. The bear symbolizes the Medo-Persian Empire, known for its ferocity and military might. The leopard with wings is associated with the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, whose conquests were unparalleled in speed. The fourth beast, the most terrifying, represents the Roman Empire, characterized by its crushing strength and expansive dominance. The climax of this vision occurs when Daniel sees one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, verse 13. Verse 14 states, "And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed." This passage points to the eternal kingdom of the Messiah, which will replace all human kingdoms and establish justice forever. In chapter 8, Daniel has another vision, this time in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, verse 1. He sees a ram with 2 horns, one larger than the other, and a goat coming from the west with a large horn between its eyes. The ram symbolizes the Medo-Persian Empire, while the goat represents the Greek Empire. In verse 21, the angel Gabriel explains, "The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king." This first king is identified as Alexander the Great. When the large horn is broken, 4 smaller horns emerge, representing the division of the Greek Empire after Alexander's death. The vision also mentions a small horn that grows and becomes great, exalting itself against the prince of the host and desecrating the sanctuary. This small horn is associated with Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a ruler who persecuted the Jewish people and profaned the temple in Jerusalem. However, the vision concludes with the promise that God will bring judgment upon him, reaffirming divine sovereignty. In chapter 9, Daniel fervently prays for the restoration of Jerusalem and the deliverance of his people. He acknowledges Israel's sins and pleads for God's mercy. In verse 4 he says, "O Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments." This heartfelt prayer is answered with one of the most significant prophecies in the book, the vision of the 70 weeks. The angel Gabriel appears to Daniel in verse 21 and delivers a detailed message about future events. In verse 24 he explains, 70 weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. The 70 weeks are interpreted as a prophetic period pointing to the coming of the Messiah and the fulfillment of God's redemptive plan. Gabriel also reveals that the Messiah will be rejected and that Jerusalem will face destruction again. In verse 26 it is written, "After the 62 weeks, the Anointed One will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary." This prophecy is widely understood as foretelling the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman army in 70 AD. These visions, though complex, carry a central message of hope. They demonstrate that God is in control of history, that human kingdoms are temporary, and that the eternal kingdom of the Messiah will prevail. For Daniel and his contemporaries, these revelations were a reminder that despite present hardships, God was working to accomplish his purposes. The visions of Daniel continue to resonate to this day, fueling theological discussions and inspiring the faith of millions. They point to the messianic hope, the redemptive work of Christ, and the promise of a future where justice and peace will reign forever. This message of hope transcends generations, showing that God's faithfulness is unshakable and that his plan will come to fruition. Through these visions, Daniel leaves us a legacy of faith, perseverance, and trust in the God who rules over all. And so, we conclude our journey through the fascinating book of Daniel, a story of unwavering faith, courage in the face of adversity, and a message of hope that echoes through the ages. Daniel and his friends show us that trusting in God, even in the most challenging circumstances, is always rewarding. They faced powerful kings, mighty empires, and even the threat of death, but remained faithful to the Lord, who never failed to stand by them. If these stories inspired you, if you felt the impact of the lessons on faithfulness and divine sovereignty, then don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends and family so that more people can discover these incredible messages. Don't forget to like the video and leave a comment sharing what stood out to you the most in Daniel's story. And of course, subscribe to the channel to follow more content like this. Turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our videos. Together, let's continue exploring the great stories and teachings of the Bible that transform lives and bring hope. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.